The night it began was neither remarkable nor kind. A soft drizzle had fallen over Oxford, blurring the outlines of its spires until the entire city seemed to waver between dream and remembrance. I had been sitting in my flat with a bottle of Glenfiddich that had, over the years, learned the contours of my hand. There was Mahler on the turntable, a symphony that seemed to unravel the hour like thread from a tired spool. I had intended to read, perhaps even to sleep, but silence, I've found, is never as restful as it pretends. I remember the knock light, uncertain. The kind one hears from someone afraid of interrupting thought. Sergeant Lewis, damp from the rain, stood at the door holding a newspaper already ruined by moisture. He didn't have to speak. I had seen that look before the quiet apology, before unpleasant work. I took the paper from him. The ink had bled across the front page, yet the headline remained legible enough. Body found in college quadrangle. A porter had discovered it at first light. The article said little, as such things always do, but the words Corpus Christi College caught at me like a half-forgotten tune. I had known a woman there once, years ago, when my belief in the decency of coincidence was still intact. Lewis spoke in the way men do when trying not to intrude on another's thoughts, said the pathologist was already on site, said the college was quiet, too quiet. He'd noticed that when people are frightened, they whisper, even outdoors. I told him to fetch the car. I needed air. Oxford before dawn carries its own kind of confession. The wet cobblestones, the windows still lit in staircases where a few earnest students read into the night. As we turned onto Merton Street, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the side mirror of a man older than his years, face drawn, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of thinking too much. The porter, a gaunt man with hands that smelled faintly of tobacco, led us through the narrow cloister to the quadrangle. The body lay near the sundial. Female, mid-30s, dark coat, one shoe missing, a scarf knotted tightly around her throat. I asked for her name, and the porter hesitated, as though names might conjure consequences. Dr. Julia Markham, Fellow in Medieval Literature. I had heard her lecture once, years ago. She spoke of silence in monastic writings, how it was both discipline and deceit. I remember thinking even then that she understood something I did not. Lewis crouched beside the body, his breath visible in the cold. He murmured something about robbery. I doubted it. Her handbag, soaked but intact, lay a few feet away, its contents arranged with the odd symmetry of haste. A fountain pen, a folded program from an evensong service, and a crossword torn halfway through. 15 across quiet Lament, 5 letters. I could almost hear her voice shaping the word. Elegy. Later, as the photographer's flash cut the mist into pieces, I wandered beneath the cloister. There were echoes there, the kind that turn footsteps into memory. A cat darted across the flagstones, vanishing through an archway like a thought abandoned mid-sentence. The porter followed my gaze and muttered about how she often walked alone at night, listening to the chapel choir rehearse. Said she'd claimed the music helped her think. I wanted to ask what she'd been thinking of that last evening, but such questions are meant for ghosts. Lewis rejoined me, shaking his head. He'd found no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond our own. I told him to look again at the windows overlooking the quadrangle. Only one, I said, bore condensation on the inside. A small thing, but I've learned that guilt, like warmth, often leaves traces on glass. By the time we left, the rain had deepened. The car's wipers laboured against it with an almost moral persistence. Lewis asked if I thought it was murder. I said I wasn't sure yet, but that something about the scene felt rehearsed, as though someone had wanted her death to seem accidental, but hadn't rehearsed the silence that would follow. He looked puzzled, and I didn't explain. When I finally returned home, I poured another measure of whiskey and stared at the crossword folded in my coat pocket. A quiet lament indeed. I thought of Julia Markham's voice echoing faintly in the chapel, and of the sound that had replaced the single, unbroken stillness of an Oxford dawn. Even now, years later, I can still hear it. The rain on the stone. The hum of a city pretending not to notice its own grief. Silence, I've come to believe, is not the absence of sound. It is the echo of what should have been said. The next morning came pale and indifferent. The rain had withdrawn, leaving the pavements slick as if the city itself had been freshly varnished in grief. I walked down to the river before reporting to the station an old habit of mine, perhaps inherited from some ancestral superstition, that water, if stared at long enough, will speak. It did not, though it had much to say that morning. The Cherwell moved slowly, almost stealthily, like a thought one tries not to think. Along the bank, reeds bent under their own thin weight, trembling with the aftertaste of rain. I had come here often enough to know the river's moods, the cold indifference of winter, the sly laughter of summer. But that morning it seemed neither. It seemed to be listening. A constable was waiting where the towpath narrowed. His boots were coated in the grey mud of early morning, and beside him 2 men from the recovery unit stood over a tarpaulin spread near the water's edge. I had no need to ask what lay beneath it. The river, too, had kept its secret poorly. It was Lewis who broke the silence first. He said her name softly, as if testing whether the river might flinch. Julia Markham. Found at first light by a rower, one of those earnest young men who believe the world begins and ends with their own heartbeat. He had thought at first it was driftwood tangled in weeds, but even driftwood, I suppose, doesn't wear a college scarf. I knelt beside the tarpaulin. Her face, pale and almost peaceful, held the calm that only water grants, a calm paid for dearly. There was no visible wound, no trace of violence beyond what drowning inflicts. Her hands were folded awkwardly, as if she had tried, in her last seconds, to shield something small and invisible. A secret, perhaps, or a decision. The pathologist would later call it accidental. Slipped, struck her head and fell into the river. But the scarf had been knotted twice, not once, as one might do to keep out the cold. Twice with the precision of intent. I said nothing then, but felt the old pulse of unease rise quietly inside me. Lewis stood by, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He had been with me long enough to recognize silence as a form of disagreement. He asked whether I believed she had fallen in herself. I told him that rivers are patient liars. They make everything look like surrender. Later we walked the length of the bank, tracing footprints that dissolved the further we went. 2 sets, perhaps 3. The mud told its half-truths, one pair heavier, pressing down toward the edge, another lighter, turned sharply away. It could have been anything, a passer-by, a witness, or the echo of something already gone. By mid-morning, the college had stirred into its uneasy rhythm. Bells tolled for lectures that would not be attended. The quad shimmered with puddles reflecting fragments of cloisters and clouds. In the porter's lodge, I asked for her room key. The man hesitated before handing it over, as though the brass itself had become dangerous to touch. Her rooms were tidy and unnatural, books aligned in a scholar's geometry, papers stacked in neat defiance of curiosity. Yet there, on the small desk by the window, was the detail that caught me. A single envelope, water-stained but unsealed. Inside it, one sheet of paper, its ink blurred to indecipherable shapes. Only the signature remained legible, Eleanor. I had seen the name once before on a library reserve slip, a colleague, perhaps, or something more delicate, more private. The sort of friendship Oxford breeds quietly and then hides beneath its robes. I replaced the letter and turned to the window. From there one could see the river glinting between trees, narrow and bright like a blade. When I left, I paused by the corridor where her shoes stood 2 pairs, both polished, one missing its left. The same left shoe, I remembered, that had not been found at the scene in the quadrangle. A small thing, perhaps, but small things have a way of whispering the loudest. That night I returned to the river once more. The city slept uneasily, its lights mirrored in the slow, indifferent current. I thought of Julia, of the unfinished crossword folded in my pocket, and of how water always returns what it takes, though not always in the same shape. I watched the current pass beneath Magdalen Bridge and wondered, as I often did, whether we ever solve anything at all or merely learn to live with the questions that survive us. I have always distrusted translators. Not the act of translation itself, that fragile bridge between languages, but the quiet authority it grants those who walk it. To translate is to choose, and every choice hides a betrayal. It was with that thought that I entered the tutorial rooms of Corpus Christi that morning, where betrayal hung invisibly in the air, faint as chalk dust. The room smelled of old paper and something faintly medicinal, the ghost of polish from oak tables scrubbed too clean. 3 tutors waited for all scholars of the medieval faculty, their faces drawn into careful neutrality. Professor Haldane, the senior among them, spoke first. He did not ask how I was, nor offer condolences. Instead, he said quite simply that Julia's absence left a gap impossible to fill before the next term. I told him we were not there to discuss scheduling. He looked down at his notes, then gestured toward the window, where a pale slice of sunlight revealed dust swirling like ancient secrets. They had all known her, he said, but perhaps not as well as they had believed. It was the second tutor, Miss Denby, who intrigued me most. Young, fiercely precise in her diction, and visibly afraid of silence. She mentioned that Julia had been working on a new translation of the Rule of St. Gilbert, a fragmentary Latin text about silence and confession. A curious project, given the nature of her death. When I asked if the work had been finished, Denby hesitated. She said Julia had been struggling with a passage that defied her, something about the moral weight of withholding truth. She used to joke, Denby added faintly, that some words resisted resurrection. Lewis, standing by the doorway, scribbled notes he would later never need. His eyes darted between us, between meaning and mystery, but I caught something in Denby's tone that felt rehearsed, as if she'd spoken these lines before to herself. I asked if Julia had confided in her. She shook her head too quickly, then added that she'd seen her walking by the river late one night, a few days before it happened. Said Julia looked unanchored, the word hung there, precise and merciless. The third tutor, Dr. Brooke, was a man of few words, his expression fixed somewhere between disdain and fatigue. He spoke only to remark that Julia had been distracted for months about correspondence she refused to share. He leaned back, and a small notebook slipped from his pocket. I bent to retrieve it, and noticed, before returning it, a faint smudge of water on its edge, river water perhaps, or whiskey. I said nothing. Afterwards, I lingered alone in the corridor. The stone floor creaked underfoot, betraying its age. On the wall hung portraits of long-dead scholars, their gazes painted with the same mild disapproval Oxford reserves for the living. Through the half-open door to Julia's study I caught sight of her desk again. The envelope still lay there, unchanged Eleanor in fading ink. But beside it now a slim Latin volume I hadn't noticed before. I turned the pages slowly, tracing her penciled annotations. Midway through, she had underlined a line that read, Veritas loquitur per silentium. Truth speaks through silence. Below it, in her hand, she had written a single word, Eleanor. I closed the book. The question mark struck me more sharply than the name. A scholar like Julia would never leave a question without pursuit. And yet she had left this one unfinished, unresolved, as if she no longer wished to know the answer. Lewis rejoined me, asking whether I believed the river had carried her there, or someone else had carried her to the river. I told him that translation, like guilt, is rarely literal. We walked out through the courtyard, the air brittle with the faint toll of chapel bells. Somewhere behind a window, a student was reciting poetry in Latin, the words rolling over the stone like a language trying to remember itself. That evening, as I wrote my notes, I found myself copying Julia's phrase again and again, unable to stop. Truth speaks through silence. Perhaps it does. Or perhaps silence only waits for someone foolish enough to listen. The next morning brought with it that particular kind of Oxford sunlight, colourless, hesitant, the sort that makes one aware of dust rather than warmth. I had slept little, my thoughts circling the edges of Julia Markham's life like a cat unwilling to enter a room. There was something about the letter, the name Eleanor, the unfinished question that clung to me. But it was Lewis who first mentioned the student. Said the bursar had been asking questions about an enrolment that no longer existed. We found him, or rather the absence of him, in the college archives. His name, Stephen Dale, appeared on a list of postgraduate students from 2 years prior. Philosophy, the most forgiving of all disciplines. But the file was slim, almost insultingly so. No dissertation, no correspondence beyond a handful of letters regarding accommodation. Then abruptly silence. I have come to trust institutional silences. They are rarely innocent. The bursar, a thin man who smelt faintly of lavender polish and suspicion, claimed that Dale had withdrawn mid-term. No explanation, only a note in his own hand requesting the closure of his file. I asked to see the note. The bursar hesitated before producing it, as if the paper itself were capable of contagion. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. But one word withdrawal had been corrected. First written, then crossed out, replaced by departure. A small distinction, but one that stayed with me. Withdrawal suggests retreat, departure implies decision. Lewis thought it all a waste of time. He said students come and go, Oxford sheds them like old leaves. But I had seen Dale's name before, written faintly in pencil at the corner of Julia's lecture register. Beside it, a single tick, attendance recorded once, and never again. We visited his old lodgings on a narrow terrace on Holywell Street, where the air smelled of damp wood and unresolved lives. The landlady, Mrs. Porter, remembered him vaguely, said he paid on time, spoke little, and read constantly. Always Latin texts, she added, though he was no classicist. He'd once mentioned Julia, but only in passing, called her the woman who understood too much. There was a pause then, the kind that grows heavier with the effort of not remembering. I asked when she had last seen him. She said it must have been late winter. He had left one evening with a suitcase and returned an hour later without it. Then gone for good the next morning. Back at the station I spread the fragments before me. The letter signed Eleanor, the translation of St. Gilbert, the vanished student, a triangle without geometry. Yet something in the symmetry of their absences troubled me. Julia's research concerned the silence Dale had disappeared into. Eleanor, whoever she was, had left only her name. 3 voices, and not one still speaking. Lewis brought in the college librarian that afternoon. A woman whose hair, like most librarians I have known, existed primarily to support her spectacles. She recalled Julia's frequent visits to the restricted section, where the older manuscripts were kept, and she mentioned something else that Julia often requested, texts already borrowed under another name, Stephen Dale. That was the moment, small and unremarkable, when deduction stirred like a half-woken bird. Two people reading the same forbidden text yet never together. Knowledge shared in absence, perhaps in secrecy. Translation again of thought, of guilt, of something not meant to be spoken. I returned to the river that evening. The air smelt of silt and resignation. Somewhere beyond Magdalen Bridge, a rower's oar struck the surface, breaking the reflection of the clouds into long, quivering fragments. I thought of Dale, of Julia, and of the way Oxford keeps its dead not buried, merely rearranged. I have often wondered what degree Stephen Dale had sought. Not the kind conferred in ceremonies with Latin prayers and brass seals. Not a quieter kind earned through the study of remorse. And though I never found his thesis, I suspect it was written not in words, but in what was left unsaid. There are evenings in Oxford that seem to exist outside of time, suspended between conversation and confession. That night at the King's Arms was one of them. Lewis had gone home early. He preferred beer to silence, and I had no taste for company that could not withstand the latter. The pub was half empty, the scent of malt and damp wood lingering in the air like a memory reluctant to fade. I had taken my usual corner table beneath the crooked painting of Magdalen Tower, a glass of Burgundy before me. The wine was not remarkable, but it served its purpose. There is a comfort in repetition, even of mediocrity. Across from me sat Professor Haldane, summoned, though he believed it was his idea. Scholars, like detectives, rarely see how easily they are manipulated by their own pride. He spoke of Julia with the solemnity one reserves for the recently dead carefully, as though she might overhear. He said she had been brilliant, unpredictable, difficult to like, but impossible to ignore. He said the river had taken her too soon, though his tone suggested something less tragic, more inevitable. I let him speak. Grief in academics often masquerades as analysis. When I asked about her translation work, his expression flickered. He claimed she had been obsessed, particularly with a passage concerning penance and secrecy. He said she had sought to modernize the language to make silence sound like salvation. A strange ambition, I thought. Silence rarely saves anyone. He poured himself another glass, his hand unsteady, and mentioned something about a dinner they'd shared the week before she died. She'd been distracted, he said, making wordplay of everything, even her wine. She'd called it vinum veritas, the truth in wine, and then smiled at her own wit. A tired cliché, perhaps, but something about the way he repeated it, as if the phrase itself carried weight, unsettled me. I asked whether she'd mentioned anyone named Eleanor. His pause was long enough to become an answer. Eventually he said the name belonged to a benefactor, one who had withdrawn funding from Julia's research a few months earlier. A dispute about the translation's tone was too secular, he thought, or perhaps too honest. Haldane seemed uncertain. He said Julia had been furious and had accused Eleanor of misunderstanding everything. The irony, I reflected later, was that Julia had probably been right. As the evening deepened, conversation gave way to abstraction. Haldane quoted lines from Horace, then forgot them halfway through. His intellect was eroding under the weight of his own memory. I asked about Stephen Dale, the student who had left without a degree. Haldane looked at me then properly, as if seeing me for the first time. He said Dale had been brilliant in his way, too much so, the kind of mind that bends under its own gravity. He refilled his glass, muttering that Dale had spent months in the Bodleian, working on the same texts as Julia. Said they argued often about translation and the ethics of interpretation. One night, he recalled, Dale had stormed out of a seminar after accusing Julia of corruption. Not moral corruption, he clarified, but linguistic. She had changed the words, he said, until they meant what she wanted. It was then, as he spoke, that a small thing occurred to me. Julia's crossword, the unfinished clue, quiet lament. I had assumed the answer was elegy, but the pattern of letters could fit another word, dirge, a harsher music, less forgiving. And in that moment I wondered if Julia's final work had been more than translation, if it had been confession, encoded in language no one else could bear to read. When Haldane left, I stayed. The pub had emptied, save for the landlord wiping the counter with a rag that smelled faintly of gin. I finished my wine and stared at the crossword folded in my notebook. Quiet lament. The clue had been too simple, and perhaps that was her last jest, a riddle for someone still foolish enough to care. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and uncommitted. I walked back along Holywell Street, the cobbles slick with reflection. Somewhere, a piano played faintly from an open window by Schubert, I think, though I couldn't be sure. The melody was incomplete, the final notes lost to the night air. I paused beneath a lamppost and looked toward the dark outline of the river. I thought of Julia, of Dale, of Eleanor, 3 names bound by silence, each translating the other's sorrow into something the rest of us could barely understand. And as the rain touched my face, I realized that truth, like wine, is best taken slowly until it begins to taste of guilt. There are places in Oxford that seem to remember what the living prefer to forget. Magdalen Lane is one of them, narrow, cobbled and perpetually damp, as though the rain, once fallen there, had decided never to leave. It was on that lane, between 2 crooked houses that leaned toward one another like old conspirators, that I first began to feel the case shift beneath me, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like ice breaking in the dark. Lewis and I had been following a small lead, one that even he had called tenuous. A bookseller on Magdalen Lane, retired now, had once kept a modest trade in Latin manuscripts. Julia Markham had been one of his few regular customers. He remembered her not for what she bought, but for what she refused to sell, a vellum-bound translation of De Silentio et Veritate, a medieval text that had belonged, oddly enough, to the same Eleanor whose name haunted Julia's final letter. The shop itself was more museum than commerce dust in high drifts, the faint perfume of mildew and ink, and a small brass bell that seemed startled by its own ringing. The man who greeted us was pale and deliberate, as if his thoughts arrived on delay. He said Julia had visited 3 times in her final month. On the last occasion, she'd brought a student, a quiet man with nervous hands and eyes that refused to meet his own reflection in the glass, Stephen Dale. The bookseller recalled that Julia had insisted on paying in cash, though the price was modest. She had wrapped the book herself in brown paper and twine, as if preparing a gift. I asked whether she had said where she was taking it. The man frowned, trying to locate the memory in some interior archive. "To the river," he said at last. The words came out flat, unconvincing, as though he were repeating something she had said without ever having understood it. Lewis shifted uneasily. He disliked conversations that circled emptiness. But I found something there, in that phrasing the river again, threading through her final days like an echo made visible. When we left the shop, evening had already settled in. Magdalen Lane was near deserted, save for the lamplight trembling across wet stone. There is a moment in Oxford twilight when everything appears older than it is, and I felt it then as if we were walking through someone else's memory, intruders in a dream that refused to end. Halfway down the lane I paused before a house with shuttered windows. The nameplate, almost illegible, bore the initials E.M. I told Lewis to note it. Eleanor Markham, perhaps a relative, a benefactor, or something more intimate. He asked whether I believed in coincidence. I told him only that Oxford doesn't. We returned later that night. The street was quiet enough to hear our own breathing. Through the shutters a light flickered briefly, then vanished. I thought I heard a piano, one hesitant chord, then nothing. Lewis muttered that it must have been the wind, but the sound had shape, intention. It was then I noticed something on the step, a folded scrap of paper caught beneath the door. I bent to retrieve it. The ink had blurred with dampness, but one phrase was still legible. The river forgives nothing. Beneath it, a faint watermark marks a college crest, Corpus Christi. When we left Magdalen Lane, the night air had turned colder. The rain had resumed its gentle persistence, tapping against the cobbles like a slow metronome. I felt that peculiar stillness sometimes comes just before understanding, not revelation exactly, but the awareness that something somewhere had just moved. Back in my flat, I placed the note beside Julia's crossword. Quiet lament. The river forgives nothing. Both fragments of thought, both half-finished. I poured myself a small whiskey, listening to the rain gather against the window pane. Magdalen Lane, the river, the woman named Eleanor, each haunting the other, each translating grief into silence. I have often thought since that night that Oxford doesn't need ghosts. It already remembers too much. There are men in Oxford who seem carved from the very stone they walk upon, ancient, unbending, their morality as cold and polished as the chapels they preside over. The Dean of Corpus Christi was such a man. I had met him before in the polite exchanges that pass for civility in academic life, but never had I thought of him as someone who might keep a diary. Men like him prefer sermons to confessions. Lewis and I arrived just after Vespers. The college was cloaked in that soft, exhausted quiet that descends when even the bells have grown tired of themselves. The porter led us through the cloister, whispering as though we were entering a tomb. The dean's rooms on the upper floor were narrow, severe, and furnished with the kind of restraint that suggests taste or penance. He greeted us with the faint irritation of a man interrupted mid-prayer. His hair was thin and perfectly arranged. His eyes, small but sharp, held the unsettling calm of a man convinced of his own righteousness. He said he had known Julia. Of course, everyone in the faculty had, but their acquaintance was formal, academic, correct. The word correct, I've found, is the most dishonest in the English language. He asked why I was interested in a dead woman's research. I told him that the living rarely kill for ideas, they kill for what ideas reveal. He smiled faintly as though humouring a student's paradox. Then when Lewis mentioned the name Eleanor, something shifted, a tightening around the eyes, too controlled to be accidental. He said the name meant nothing to him. His voice was careful, its stillness rehearsed. Afterward, while he fetched the attendance ledgers, I wandered toward the bookcase that dominated his study. Rows of theological texts, their spines cracked from excessive certainty. But one shelf seemed out of order, a slim gap where dust had been recently disturbed. I slid my hand along it and felt a faint resistance. A panel, perhaps, or something meant to appear unremarkable. When I pressed lightly, the wood yielded, revealing a recess just large enough to hold a small, leather-bound notebook. Lewis looked at me with that weary expression he reserves for my more intrusive curiosities. The dean returned just as I was turning the first page. The air in the room seemed to contract. He said that was private, and I said everything in Oxford was until someone drowned. He hesitated, then gestured for me to read. I did so slowly, aloud, the ink thin and deliberate. The diary began 6 months earlier. Reflections on sin, on the difficulty of forgiveness, and then the entries changed. A name appeared, not Julia, not Stephen Dale, but E.M. He wrote of a benefactor, a woman whose donations had preserved the college's reputation, but whose influence had become suffocating. He wrote of meetings by the river, of letters burned, of threats unspoken but understood. Eleanor. When I asked who she was, the dean said only that benefactors expect obedience disguised as gratitude. He closed the diary, his hand trembling slightly. He confessed that Eleanor had funded Julia's translation project on condition that certain passages be omitted. Julia had refused. The funding had been withdrawn, but the relationship, whatever it had been, did not end. Lewis asked if he believed Eleanor capable of harm. The dean shook his head. She was not cruel, he said, merely afraid. Afraid of what Julia might uncover, afraid of her own reflection in the words she had once paid to suppress. We left him sitting in the dark, the diary still on his desk, the lamplight resting like accusation on its cover. Outside, the rain had resumed, steady and indifferent. Lewis muttered that it proved nothing, that the dean was simply another old man tangled in his own morality. Perhaps he was right, but as we walked back along I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase Julia had underlined in her notes, "Truth speaks through silence." Later that night in my flat, I opened my own notebook and drew a line between 3 names, Julia, Eleanor, and the dean. And beside them, a single phrase from the diary, "The river cleanses nothing." It struck me then that the college, for all its sermons and Latin, was built on the same quiet deceit as the river itself, both pretending to absolve, both carrying the dead downstream in peaceable disguise. And as I closed my book, I realized that somewhere in that current, the truth was still moving, not lost, merely waiting for the next bend. The rehearsal took place in the college chapel that evening, though calling it a rehearsal seemed generous. A handful of students, a harpsichord borrowed from the music room, and a choir director who looked as though he'd long since misplaced his patience. They were preparing for a memorial service for Julia's As It Happened, and the irony of it was not lost on me. A woman who had lived her life studying silence would now be commemorated in song. Lewis and I stood at the back, the air faint with candle smoke and furniture polish. The music began, a slow, uncertain Kyrie that drifted upward and fell back again, like a prayer unsure of its recipient. I had not intended to attend, but habit is a kind of faith, and I have always trusted habit more than conviction. The choir director, a young man with hair the colour of damp leaves, approached us during the interval. He said Julia had been here often, listening to their rehearsals, sometimes standing alone by the organ loft, her face unreadable. Once she'd asked to borrow the hymn book, the one used only by the senior fellows. He remembered because she'd underlined a line from the Dies Irae, in faint pencil, "The guilty tremble, though unspoken their sin." I asked if the book was still there. He hesitated, then led me to the vestry, where the hymnals lay stacked in quiet obedience. The one he handed me bore a faint watermark on its cover, the college crest again, blurred by damp. Inside, beneath the underlined line, she had written 2 initials, S.D. Stephen Dale. Lewis frowned when I showed him, said it proved nothing. I told him proof was a word beloved by scientists and lawyers, but rarely by truth. As the choir resumed, I wandered to the side aisle. The chapel smelled of stone and dust and the lingering perfume of old candles. I looked up at the organ from a narrow ledge with a view of the entire congregation. If one were to fall or be pushed, the body would land among the pews below. A symbolic descent, I thought, fitting for someone who had spent her life balancing sin and syntax. Later, as the music swelled again, I noticed something peculiar. One of the students, a young man near the front, sang without opening his hymn book. His hands trembled slightly, and his gaze remained fixed on the stained glass rather than the conductor. After the rehearsal, I found him outside, smoking in the cloister, his fingers still shaking. He said he had known Julia. She had tutored him once briefly. She'd told him that language was not meant to conceal, but to reveal that translation, done honestly, is an act of mercy. He said she'd seemed frightened lately, though of what he couldn't say. Once, during a tutorial, she'd asked him to read aloud a passage from St. Augustine, "We are restless until we rest in thee." But then she'd added quietly, as if to herself, "And some of us never do." It was then that I noticed his scarf had the same pattern as the one found around her neck. When I asked where he'd got it, he said it was the college design, sold in the porter's lodge. Yet the weave was finer, the colour slightly faded, as if older. I said nothing. There are moments when silence gathers its own kind of evidence. That night, back in my flat, I laid the hymn book beside Julia's crossword and the letter from Magdalen Lane. The pattern was beginning to form faintly, like the first outline of a constellation one can almost but not quite name. The initials, SD, the scarf, the river, the echo of a line about guilt unspoken. I poured myself a whiskey and watched the ice turn pale gold in the glass. Somewhere outside, the bells of Magdalen struck the quarter hour soft, reluctant, as though mourning their own precision. Julia's death, I realized then, had not been spontaneous. It had been composed and arranged, even the way a conductor arranges his final note, knowing silence will complete what music cannot. A death rehearsed, perfected in stillness. And somewhere, someone had played their part to the end. It was in the reading room of the Bodleian that the final piece began, almost imperceptibly, to drift into place. Not full drift, the distinction matters. Truth rarely falls upon us. It arrives slowly, uninvited, and almost always when we have ceased to demand it. The afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows in weary strips, settling on the tables where scholars bent over manuscripts as though prayer still mattered. Lewis had gone to fetch coffee. He'd grown impatient with the quiet, and said the smell of parchment made him claustrophobic. I stayed behind because I had begun to suspect that Julia's translation, or rather its absence, was the key to everything. Her final project, the work on St. Gilbert, had vanished from the archives. No official withdrawal, no recorded handover. Yet someone had returned a copy last week, unsigned, catalogued under a false call number, a misplaced translation, as the librarian put it, with the small, almost satisfied smile of a woman who likes her mysteries tidy. The manuscript lay before me now, Latin on one page, English on the facing side, her hand precise but uneven toward the end. The ink grew faint, as though exhaustion had entered through the nib. I read the last translated line. In silence lies redemption, but only the innocent can hear it, and beneath it, a marginal note in her handwriting. He said the river forgives everything. He lied. I had seen that phrase before, folded into the note from Magdalen Lane. So Julia had copied her own words, or someone else's, into both places. The repetition was deliberate. A code, perhaps not one of concealment, but of emphasis. She wanted it remembered. Lewis returned with 2 paper cups and a look that told me the world outside had disappointed him yet again. He said the librarian had mentioned a student coming in last week to request that same manuscript. He couldn't recall the name. only that the student was insistent it be checked under the old catalogue, not the new. Old catalogue. I turned to the front page. The call number was faintly erased, overwritten. Beneath it, just visible in the paper's grain, the ghost of another number 1 belonging not to theology, but to English literature. Dale's department. I told Lewis to have the librarian bring me the visitor log from that day. He sighed that long, eloquent sigh that accompanies every task he deems unnecessary, and went. When he returned, the name stood out instantly, Stephen Dale. He had signed in 3 days before Julia's death. Time enough to read, to copy, perhaps even to change. I traced her final page again. The translation had diverged from the Latin, subtly, beautifully, fatally. A line that should have read, through confession, one is cleansed, had become through concealment, one endures, a small alteration, but one that inverted meaning entirely. I imagined Dale seeing that, furious at her distortion, perhaps believing she had corrupted the text or him. Yet the handwriting was not quite consistent. Her letters slanted differently near the end, the strokes heavier, as though written by someone mimicking her style, but without her restraint, a forgery born of obsession. The library clock struck 5, its chime absorbed by the books. Lewis asked if it meant we had our man. I told him it meant only that truth had begun to shift again, as it always does when you think you've found its edges. When we stepped outside, the evening light had already drained from the sky, leaving Oxford pale and uncertain. The cobblestones gleamed like wet slate. I thought of Julia's translation of her final, deliberate mistruth, and wondered whether it was her way of confessing or condemning. A misplaced translation indeed, not just of Latin to English, but of meaning to misunderstanding. Somewhere between them she had left her final message, and we had all been reading it wrong. It was raining again that evening, a soft, exhausted kind of rain that seemed less an event than an afterthought, the sort Oxford is built to receive. I had found myself once more at Corpus, though I could not have said why. There are places, I think, that draw you not through reason, but through recognition. The quadrangle was almost deserted, the stone slick with reflected lamplight. Somewhere, faintly, a piano sounded from a distant room, hesitant, incomplete. Lewis had gone to interview Dale. He'd found him living in a shabby student lodging near Jericho under an assumed name, teaching Latin to pay his rent. Lewis said the man looked tired enough to fall asleep mid-sentence. I told him exhaustion was often the last refuge of guilt, but when he'd gone I realized I'd said it more to fill the silence than from conviction. The porter let me into Julia's rooms once more. They had been left undisturbed since her death, or at least that was the official story. Dust has a way of testifying to the contrary. The air smelt faintly of dried ink and lilies long since gone brittle. On the desk still lay her notes, her translation drafts, and a half-finished letter written in her small, meticulous hand. "To the Dean," it began, though the ink faltered midway through the word. I read the last complete sentence aloud to myself, a habit I've never entirely broken. Truth, when buried beneath devotion, grows roots of its own. Beneath the line, a small blot of ink like the full stop of someone's conscience. I sat down and studied the handwriting again, tracing the rhythm of it, and something, finally, flickered. Julia's earlier letters, the ones to Eleanor, the ones found among her papers, had been written in a precise, slanted script. But this one was different, straighter, controlled, as though written by a hand imitating calm. The same false steadiness I had seen in the later pages of her translation, the same as Dale's. The room was utterly still. Even the rain outside seemed to have paused, waiting. It occurred to me then that the letter was not unfinished. It had been abandoned deliberately, not out of fear, but fatigue, a scholar's kind of surrender. Lewis returned around 9, his coat dripping, his expression unreadable. He said Dale had denied everything, though in the way that innocent men rarely do. Said Julia had been the only pers-on who understood him, the only one who saw beyond his failures. Said he had gone to the river that night to look for her, not to harm her. The words fell into that small Oxford room like coins into water, vanishing as they touched the surface. I poured us each a measure of whiskey from the small flask I keep in my coat. Lewis drank too quickly. I let mine sit. He asked what I thought. I told him I wasn't sure, that some stories resist conclusion the way truth resists clarity. I saw him watching me, waiting for the deduction I no longer wanted to make. There was one last item on the desk, a thin book of verse, elegies for the living. Inside the cover, an inscription in Julia's handwriting, for S.D. May, words, "One day, forgive us." The line was too intimate to ignore, too final to explain. Later, walking back through the drizzle, I stopped beneath the chapel archway. The bells of Merton tolled faintly in the distance, blurred by rain. I thought of Julia, of Dale, of Eleanor, each bound to the other by the same faith that had ruined them, the faith that meaning could be controlled, that words could be trusted to stay where they were placed. A scholar's lament, indeed, not for knowledge lost, but for its cost. When I reached my flat, I poured another glass and opened the crossword folded in my pocket. I filled in the last empty clue, 7 down unanswered prayer, 6 letters. Regret. It fits, of course. It was not the confession I expected, nor the one I had sought. In the end, it arrived in the quiet way most truths do, half drunk, half regretted, and wholly too late. The evening had drawn itself into that familiar Oxford hush, the kind that settles between the chime of chapel bells and the closing of pub doors. I was back at the King's Arms, my usual corner, the wine darker than the hour. Lewis had gone home long ago, muttering something about early mornings and empty wallets. I stayed behind, not for the company, the pub was nearly empty, but for the silence that comes when everyone has stopped pretending to listen. I had begun idly working at a crossword someone had left on the table, though my thoughts wandered back, again and again, to Julia. The crossword's clue read 13 down, a truth spoken too late. 8 letters. I stared at it for a long while before realizing I already knew the answer. Confession. The word fits, both in the grid and in the case. It was just then that I saw Stephen Dale, standing by the doorway, his face pale and thinner than I remembered. He looked at me as though he'd rehearsed the moment and still found it unbearable. He asked if he might sit. I gestured to the chair opposite without speaking. He ordered nothing. His hands were restless, his eyes the colour of cold tea. He said he'd heard I'd been reading Julia's translation. He said it softly, as though afraid the words themselves might be overheard. I told him it was beautiful work. He smiled at that, not in pride, but in defeat. He said Julia had shown him the last passage she'd written, the one she'd called The River's Gospel. He said she'd wanted to change the ending. In the original Latin, the text promised redemption through silence, but Julia had translated it differently. Through confession comes peace. He said they'd argued for hours, each defending their version as if it were their soul. I asked him what happened that night by the river. He didn't answer at once. He stared into the wood of the table, tracing the old rings left by careless glasses. Then he said she'd gone to meet Eleanor, to return the manuscript, perhaps to end something that had never been wholly academic. He had followed, foolishly, hoping to stop her. He saw them arguing by the water's edge, saw Eleanor turn away, saw Julia slip or perhaps step into the current, He didn't know which. He only knew he hadn't moved fast enough to save her. When I asked why he hadn't told anyone, his voice cracked in that small, undignified way guilty sometimes does. He said Eleanor had begged him to stay silent, said she'd confess in her own time, but she never did. He said he'd spent the month since trying to rewrite her translation, to make the words atone where he could not. I poured him a glass of wine and pushed it across the table. He stared at it for a long while before lifting it to his lips. He said he'd never understood why Julia had chosen that title for her final lecture, In Vino Veritas. He thought it was a joke. But now, he said, he understood. Truth, like wine, loosens the tongue only to tighten the conscience. When he left, he said nothing more. I watched him go, his shadow bending against the rain-lit street. I knew he would not return to his lodgings. Some men vanish into guilt the way others vanish into prayer. I sat there long after closing, the crossword still open before me. The last clue unsolved, 10 across what remains after faith. 5 letters. I tried to believe, then doubt, neither fit. In the end, I wrote in silence. The barman cleared the tables, humming tunelessly. I finished the bottle. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the drizzle, each lamp a faint benediction. I thought of Julia's voice, steady hand on a line of translation, her insistence that words could cleanse what the river could not. Perhaps she was right, or perhaps the river, in its quiet persistence, had always known the greater truth that confession changes nothing except the silence that follows. I remember the morning after as though it never quite began. Oxford under rain, not the cleansing kind, but the sort that seems to seep into the stone and stay there. The river had risen again, swollen and slow, its surface the colour of old pewter. I stood on Magdalen Bridge watching it, though I could no longer say what I hoped to see. Perhaps something Julia had left behind, something that might float back into meaning. Lewis arrived late, as he always did, when the case had already decided to end itself. He said Dale was gone. The room in Jericho left neat, the rent paid, the window open as if for air. On the table, a single note, a translation of a Latin line written in her hand. Silentia loquuntur. The silences speak. He thought it was a confession. I told him not to be so certain. Not every word written at the end is an admission. Some are just echoes. We walked through the rain toward the college. The porter watched us pass without greeting. Oxford, like grief, prefers discretion. Julia's room had finally been cleared, her books boxed, her name erased from the notice board. Yet I could still smell the faint trace of lilies and dust, the same scent that had lingered in the Bodleian that afternoon when I first saw her translation. The lines she had altered through concealment, one endures, remained fixed in my mind. Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps endurance, not confession, is what saves us in the end. Lewis said the dean had resigned. Health officially, conscience unofficially. Eleanor Markham, too, had disappeared from the benefactors list. The bursar called it a private withdrawal. Oxford tidies its scandals the way a housekeeper folds linens precisely, invisibly, with just enough air between the creases to let things breathe. We stood for a while in the quadrangle. The rain came down softly on the flagstones, erasing the edges of everything. Lewis asked what I thought really happened. I told him I wasn't sure. That Julia had drowned in truth as much as water. That Dale had loved her, perhaps. That Eleanor had feared her, certainly. That guilt had moved between them like a current unseen but relentless. He said he hated not knowing. I told him certainty was a poor substitute for understanding. He looked at me the way younger men look at older ones they're beginning, unwillingly, to resemble. When he left, I walked to the chapel. The candles from the memorial still burned faintly, their wax pooling like melted memories. On the lectern lay the hymn book Julia had underlined, "The guilty tremble, though unspoken their sin." Beneath it, the initials SD remained. I traced them with a finger, and for a moment thought I saw the faint impression of her handwriting over his, as if both had touched the page in the same breath. Back home, the evening slipped quietly into itself. I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The crossword lay open beside me, the same one I'd begun at the King's Arms. Only one clue remained, 12 across. That which lingers when all else is gone. 5 letters. I didn't need to think long. I wrote about ghosts. It fits too well. I closed the notebook and listened to the city settle bicycles clattering over cobbles, footsteps fading down wet lanes, the river murmuring its endless sermon beneath it all. People often ask whether a case ever truly ends. I tell them no, we merely stop chasing it, and it follows us instead quietly, patiently, like a shadow that knows our stride. Julia's name never left the college records, not really. The archivist later told me it reappeared faintly, penciled beside a shelf number in the catalogue. Her translation misfiled once again, waiting. And sometimes, on nights like this, I still imagine her voice somewhere in that silence, reading her final line aloud, not as confession, nor lament, but as truth. The silences speak.